Hi, it's Shadow Hero 90, welcoming you to my show, Sexism in Movies and TV, where I more or less call out the insane level of misandry that these retards in Hollywood put in both film and television. Now, I've been doing this show for 7 years. But the reason as to why what you'll be seeing this season could be worse is the fact that it's marketed towards children. A demographic that doesn't exactly know how the world works and can easily be misled. Now, what I reviewed in the Season 6 finale was gynocentric, sexist, and misandric to a degree where there's no way I would be able to get through a third viewing of this piece of shit. I'm currently working on this book. In this book, I'm going to be proposing a theory. And part of that theory is that gynocentric shows, like the ones that I will be attacking this season, are the reasons why young boys and young men have such unbelievably low self-esteem. And it's because that all of this sexist bullcrap is marketed to kids. So, anyways, I welcome you to the 7th season of Sexism in Movies and TV. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Sexism in Movies and TV. And if you haven't already guessed, yeah, I'm going to be reviewing the Courage the Cowardly Dog episode, The Mask. And let me just say, I know that I'm not going to be making any friends ripping into this piece of shit. You see, this is the type of episode that for some reason everyone on the internet loves, even though they get the metaphor. The metaphor kind of works, but it's just one of those episodes where the writers really messed up, and the episode has unfortunate implications written all over it. With that out of the way, let's start the review. A masked woman shows up at the Baggs residence in Nowhere, Kansas, and they're kind enough to let her stay with them. And instantly, this masked woman is more or less a terrible house guest. She both insults and criticizes Eustace and Muriel, and worst of all, she physically abuses Courage every chance she gets. Why the Baggs don't just kick this bitch off their property is beyond me. We find out that the masked woman, Kitty, had a best friend named Bunny, who is now living this abusive life with this criminal bloodhound. And a lot of people have said that this is a metaphor for pimps and prostitutes, or a metaphor for a toxic relationship. Okay, so we get the metaphor. Dogs are a metaphor for men and boys. So anyways, Courage goes out of his way to save Bunny. Bunny is safe, and Kitty leaves, never to be seen again. The end. Now, this is the part where I rip into all of the horrible implications of this episode. Now, there are a lot of pretentious retards out there who think that metaphors are basically a synonym for good. They are not. And I'll admit that The Mask's metaphors are its greatest strengths, but they're also the show's greatest weakness. I mean, okay, they want to say that dogs are a metaphor for men and boys. Okay, now here's the reason why that metaphor basically makes this whole thing a cycle of abuse. And an unfair one at that. Believe it or not, Courage is kind of Eustace and Muriel's grandson, be it an adopted grandson, but grandson nonetheless. The Cajun Fox, from the very first episode, refers to Muriel as Granny when talking to Courage. That much has been established. So when you apply metaphors to a cartoon like this, it basically comes off as this rude, ungrateful bitch is leeching off this poor elderly couple and assaulting their grandson every chance she gets. And by no means does Kitty ever have a moment of reflection where she realizes she's become just as bad as the crook who now abuses her friend. We never get that scene. Courage rescues her, and they're reunited, but then she leaves, and, I don't really remember what becomes of Bunny after this, but by no means, this was not a good ending. Kitty just gets a train ride out of here. I mean, if, hypothetically the police had shown up, and both Kitty and the Bloodhound were arrested for everything they did in this episode, it would have a purpose. If Kitty actually had an epiphany about what a terrible person she is, it would have a purpose. And if Courage had been working with the Bloodhound, and essentially the episode ends with this guy having both Kitty and Bunny working for him, or as his girlfriends that he'd abuse, then this episode would have had a purpose. And now that I think about it, episodes like this are really irresponsible. if you get the metaphor, it basically tells girls that all men are evil. If you don't get the metaphor, it's more or less just seeing an innocent child getting beaten, basically of no fault of their own, and the abuser gets off scot-free. Because she was a woman, she gets no consequences. Whether or not kids get the metaphor or not, I got the metaphor when I was a kid and was thoroughly disgusted, but that's beside the point. Whether or not kids get the metaphor, this is the kind of thing that's extremely irresponsible to put on TV. And since this episode wants to wear its metaphor on its sleeve, there is a huge chance that Courage might end up becoming like the Bloodhound here, due to the abuse that he received at the hands of this bitch. Well, yeah. I mean, if we want to go by the metaphor, this would have been a traumatic incident. And since we never see Bunny again, she most likely went and tracked down Kitty so they could be best friends and completely ignore the trauma that Kitty put this child through. I mean, Courage literally bent over backwards and risked his life to either get her out of his hair or to stop the beatings. And she doesn't even apologize! Okay, and since this episode wants to be, metaphorical to the point where it wears its metaphor on its sleeve, to either be a story about a cat, a metaphor for a woman who thinks that dogs, who are a metaphor for men, are all evil, well, let's say that we flip the script. It's the metaphor. Let's say there's a story about a divorced couple, and the guy fails to pay his ex-wife what he owes her. So she calls the police, and then this guy here gets thrown in prison, and then we cut to his friend, who basically is real upset that his divorced friend is basically rotting in prison. So this guy basically comes across an elderly couple who's watching their granddaughter, and then we see this guy who thinks all women are evil and has a reason to think so, constantly beats the shit out of this little girl at every opportunity, until she eventually snaps, helps this man's best friend out of prison, all just so the beatings will stop. And because the grandparents are completely oblivious to what's going on, and we pretend that this is a happy ending, and we basically can pretend that this is a happy ending, and that the little girl will physically recover, and that she will grow up to be a healthy member of society with no form of trauma whatsoever, and no chance that she's gonna grow up into a man-hating feminist because of this whole experience. Since this episode wants to deal with themes of domestic abuse, or toxic relationships, or a story about prostitutes and pimps, which was one interpretation I heard. Either way, it's a terrible concept, because we're seeing an abuser get off scot-free. Never really apologizes. She just leaves without even realizing that she was wrong or trying to repay the boy she beat senseless constantly several times. In short, The Mask was a terrible episode of Courage the Cowardly Dog. Ball of Revenge was a better episode than this steaming lump of crap. And with that said, I'm cementing my status as the king of unpopular opinions as I hereby declare this review over.